This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Josephus discussed some of the atrocities that were going to take place when the Romans attacked Jerusalem in AD 70. He records that there were over 1 million people that were killed as a result of the attack by the Roman armies. Jesus, in discussing the destruction of Jerusalem, Matthew chapter 24, said that unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been spared. It was such a terrible thing that he said that such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, or ever shall. There's nothing in recorded history that would merit this kind of event, according to Jesus' words. And he said that if those days had not been cut short, God brought an end to the rampage of the Romans, that no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days were in fact cut short. Verse 22. Then he says in verse 23, "Then if anyone says to you, Behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him." All right, once again, we have this force trying to mislead people. He says, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders so as to mislead, if possible, the very elect." We still have the problem of people that are trying to mislead, those that will point to the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem and the wars and the rumors of wars and all of the other things that Jesus had mentioned previously, and will try to use those as fodder, as support to prove that they are the Christ. And Jesus even says that they will show great signs and wonders. This is the same terminology that's used in other places to describe the miracles of Jesus. These were genuine miracles, there's no doubt about that, but they're being done by false Christs, and they're all done to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Well, there are lots of passages in the Bible that warn about the potential of being misled. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 6, and Colossians 2 verse 8, Galatians 6, 7, 1 John 2 and verse 26, and Revelation 12 and verse 9. We've got to be very, very careful that we are not ourselves misled. All right, Jesus goes on in verse 25 and says, "Behold, I have told you in advance." He's warned them, forewarned, forearmed. He's told them in advance about what is about to take place. When they see the Roman armies, they should know they need to get out of town. When they see these individuals that are performing great signs and wonders and claiming to be the Christ, Jesus has told them in advance that these false Christs are going to come. "I have warned you." They should know that these are not true prophets of God, even though they might work miracles. "If therefore they say to you, Behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go forth. Behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them." There are these individuals that are trying to direct you to the Christ, trying to show you where the Christ is. Don't believe these individuals. Jesus is here now. He's the only Christ. He is the only one that is going to be able to teach them the truth. He says, verse 27, "For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be." All these men are pointing to various signs, and they're trying to draw attention to their own teachings. Jesus says, what I'm talking about is going to be very clear, very distinctive. Just like when the lightning flashes in the sky, it's going to be something that all are going to be able to see it. There's no doubt that this is going to be a work of Jesus. All right, we do have some things to discuss here, and I'll make this comment at this point, and then we'll try to go back a little bit later and try to substantiate this statement. But Jesus is not here talking about the second coming, the end of time with Judgment Day. He is not saying that in verse 27 with this lightning illustration and the terminology, the coming of the Son of Man. He is not here talking about his second coming. He is talking about his coming in judgment. When Jesus comes in judgment upon Jerusalem through the medium of the Roman armies, it's going to be something that's as clear and as visible and as distinctive a sign as a lightning flash in the sky that people from great distances apart are going to be able to clearly recognize the sign. That's how powerful a sign the coming of the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be. He says in verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Now, some suggest this means that the birds of carrion know that a person is dead. So they will no doubt know that Jerusalem is dead, and they are all going to try to feed upon the corpses that are found within the city of Jerusalem, not in a literal way, but the false prophets are going to try to feed upon the people. The false prophets are those that are the vultures. So where the corpse is, this is Jerusalem, the vultures, the false prophets, are going to gather, and they're all going to be pointing to this sign, claiming that they as prophets had been predicting the second coming. Not the second coming, but the coming of Jesus in the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, we know that this surely is not talking about the second coming, the final coming of Jesus before the destruction of Jerusalem, because why would false prophets be acting as vultures, trying to draw credit to themselves and their own prophecies if Jesus is talking about the second coming? Because once the second coming occurs, men are going to be standing before God in the day of judgment. The great division is going to occur, and it's going to be over. Those prophets themselves are going to be standing before God to be held accountable for their own lives. There won't be, in other words, when Jesus comes again, there will not be time for any false prophets to gather anywhere, because they are going to be standing before God on the day of judgment. Jesus has to be, up to this point, still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And so the lightning flash and the coming of the Son of Man, mentioned there in verse 27, still has to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now we have the word immediately. In apocalyptic language, this doesn't have to be chronological. Now, Jesus is using what's called apocalyptic figurative language. The Jews love to use this apocalyptic language. The Old Testament has a number of writings that are apocalyptic, such as sections in the book of Daniel and in the book of Isaiah. We have apocalyptic language, apocalyptic terminology. And so, this doesn't have to be, well, this happened, and then immediately after this happened. But this is all a part of the same time frame, series of events that Jesus is talking about. These days, the tribulation of those days, he says, the sun is going to be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. All right? Now, is this talking about the second coming of Jesus, the coming that we're looking forward to when Jesus is going to bring all men before him in judgment? Well, once again, we need to take consideration into a number of factors here by looking at this very interesting passage. Since Jesus did not immediately come after AD 70, this naturally must refer to something other than the second coming. He's talking about something other than the second coming here in verse 29. Now, this is something that gets a lot of people excited and say, boy, the sun will be darkened, moon not give its blood, the stars fall from the sky, the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and so on. That's got to be referring to the second coming of Jesus. Well, Jesus mentions that This will occur immediately after the tribulation of those days, using this apocalyptic language to indicate just how important these events are. Now, I want you to note biblical apocalyptic language and how that apocalyptic language is used. First of all, the concept of the sun being darkened. Are you aware that Isaiah in chapter 13 uses the sun being darkened to refer to the fall of Babylon? The sun being darkened is used by Ezekiel to refer to the distress of Egypt. And then the sun being darkened is used to describe the day of Pentecost in Joel 2:28 and following, as quoted by Peter in Acts chapter 2 and verse 20. Well, how about the stars falling? Are you aware that the stars falling is apocalyptic terminology to refer to the fall of Edom in Isaiah 34 and verse 4? Well, what about the coming on the clouds? This too is typical apocalyptic language. It's a phrase that refers to the referring to the clouds with God coming in judgment, and that's seen in Isaiah, Lamentations, as well as in Ezekiel, the 30th chapter. So his coming in the clouds, he's using the clouds. The clouds are those that are coming in judgment. All right, so we look at verse 29. We are not tied into the idea of it being apocalyptic language. And then we go on to verse 30. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with great power and great glory. You say, well, surely verse 30 then is talking about the second coming, because look at what it says. The Son of Man is coming in the clouds of the sky, and so on and so forth. In Daniel chapter 7 and verse 13, we have there a description of the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and it's a symbol of his kingly reign and the dominion of his reign. The destruction of Jerusalem was not simply a Roman act, but it was the divine presence of Jesus coming in judgment. When we look at the coming that's mentioned there in verse 30, Jesus did in fact come in judgment against the Romans, against Jerusalem, and then he came in judgment against the Romans as evidence in the book of Revelation. How many times, as you read the first several chapters, those letters to the seven churches of Asia, do we talk about coming, Jesus coming, I'm coming to you, and I'm going to come and do this? There are lots of passages in the Bible that refer to Jesus coming. And so this is another indication of that same type of judgment terminology. Jesus coming in the clouds. He will appear in the sky. The tribes of the earth will mourn. They're going to see the Son of Man coming. Now, granted, there are passages that talk about every eye shall see him and so on, but this is not talking about the end of time. This is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, verse 31, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Once again, using judgment terminology, this is Jesus coming. He's coming in a very powerful way in a judgment context, and that's what is going to take place. You say, well, yeah, but it says the trumpet. He's going to gather together the elect from the four winds. And when we get to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31 and following, similar terminology is going to be used. Now, there's no doubt that the terminology in Matthew 25 is referring to the second coming. But in the context of this section, especially verses 29 through 31, since verse 29 and verse 30 still fall within a destruction of Jerusalem context, then it's logical to see that verse 31 would also fall within that same context. Well, what about the idea of gathering from one end of the sky to the other and so on? This continues the usage of Jewish apocalyptic terminology. And let's be careful not to project back into the Bible our conception about how language should work and how Jewish apocalyptic language should function. We've had people that have gone to apocalyptic language and they say, well, the Bible says the sun's going to be darkened, it has to be darkened. The Bible says the moon's going to be turned to blood. Well, I believe that it's going to have to be turned into blood. This is a kind of ignorance that makes Bible study very, very difficult to understand for a lot of people. We need to understand Jewish apocalyptic terminology. They love to use expressions like this, and God is inspiring Matthew. And as Matthew is quoting Jesus in Jesus' words here, that this is something that Jesus is talking about, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when Jesus comes in destruction. He comes with the Roman armies to destroy the city of Jerusalem. Now, we have more evidences to prove in just a moment that we are still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, so we go on. Let's look at verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. All right, so here's the point of the parable. Even though you're suffering, remember that Christ is near. There are more good things coming. Don't think that all hope is lost. When you look at the fig tree and you see that the branch is tender, you see that the leaves are starting to sprout, that's an indication that we're just about ready to enjoy the figs again. Summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that He is here right at the door. When you see the things that Jesus is describing, you know that's an indication that Jesus is near. Even though He's not there in the flesh, Jesus is still near. You have proof of that by the signs that Jesus are giving. He says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. All right? The word that is translated generation here in this particular verse, this is a part of what the premillennials will say has to refer to the Jewish race. As a matter of fact, even in the New American Standard footnote, it's got our race. This is the Greek word Genea, Genea, would be how it would be transliterated into English. In the Gospel of Matthew, this word, every time it occurs, talks about the people that are alive at the time that Jesus is talking about. This is the fall of the temple is going to occur before this generation. These people that are alive right here and now are going to die. All right, here are some references that you can jot down in your own study to show that the way Jesus uses generation is to talk about these people right then in that particular generation. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 17, chapter 11 verse 16, chapter 12 verses 39 and 41 and 45, Matthew chapter 16 verse 28, Matthew chapter 10 verse 23, and Matthew chapter 23 verse 36. Also, outside of the Gospel of Matthew, you could look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 38, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11, verse 50 and 51, and Luke 17, 25. Jesus uses this word consistently. He's not saying that none of these things are going to take place until the Jewish race passes away. He's talking about this generation. The people to whom Jesus is talking about, they are going to witness what it is that He has described. Heaven and earth, He says, will pass away, but my words will not pass away. What Jesus is saying, what Jesus is teaching is fact. And there is nothing that is going to stop these things from taking place. All right, let's look at verse 34. He says, or verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows. Now, before we go on, let's pause just a moment. Did you notice that Jesus changed the demonstrative pronoun? Now, the whole chapter of Matthew chapter 24, I believe, can be divided accordingly. Verses 1 through 35 has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. And then verse 36, going all the way through verse 51, deals with the second coming of Christ. All right, remember that. 1 through 35, destruction of Jerusalem. 36 through 51, the second coming of Christ. Now, there are two other divisions, or two other considerations to support this division. First of all, and let's take some time with this to make sure it's clear. Everything up until verse 36 has a sign. Did you notice that? In verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. Verse 27, just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, that's something that you see. And then verse 30, and then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and so on. So these things all had a sign. Whereas, beginning with verse 36, the second coming has no sign. But of that day and hour, he says, no one knows, verse 36. In verse 42, he says, but be on the alert, because you do not know what day your Lord is coming. Verse 44, for this reason you be ready too, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't think that he will. And then in verse 50, the master of that slave will come on a day when he doesn't expect him, and an hour that he does not know. So the destruction of Jerusalem was filled with signs. The Christians could see. They could see the signs, the wars, the rumors of wars, the false prophets, and all of those things, and they could tell when the destruction was about to take place, especially the sign of the abomination of desolation. All right, now that's one very compelling reason to suspect that this division, chapter 1 through 35, is the destruction of Jerusalem, and 36 and following is the second coming of Christ, is accurate. But there's still another consideration. How about the use of the demonstrative pronouns? All along, Jesus has been talking about those days. You've got the word those, and then you've got the plural, days are these things. In verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days. In verse 33, he says, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near. Verse 34, which is a very important verse, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the same demonstrative pronoun, those are these, and then the plural, days are things. And then in verse 36, he changes the demonstrative pronoun to that, and then he goes to the word day and makes it singular. The destruction of Jerusalem and all of the events that Jesus is describing is that which stretched out over a period of time. It wasn't on one day, but it was several days. But when Jesus comes again, it's going to be on a day. Look at John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29. But do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tomb shall hear his voice and come forth. In John chapter 6, you have a number of times that Jesus is talking about that day. There is going to be a day of judgment, the day of the Lord, 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 1 and following. So when Jesus gets to verse 36, he says, that, but of that day. And so everything up to verse from 1 to 35 is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And now as we get to verse 36, we are talking about the second coming of Christ. Now remember that they asked the question, what is going to be the sign of your coming? All right, the sign of his coming were going to be the abomination of desolation, the Roman armies. The sign of his coming were going to be all of the false prophets that were going to gather like vultures. And then the last question that they asked, and the end of the age, or the end of the world. Now Jesus is going to answer that second question. So we divided the apostles' question into three parts. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming? Those two questions actually had to deal with the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we divided their questions into three. The third part actually was a question that Jesus answered at the end of the age, has to do with the second coming of Christ and the day of judgment. Now Jesus, beginning in verse 36, is going to answer that particular question. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. All right, Jesus, while he was in the flesh, did not know the day that God had determined that he was going to come back in judgment of all the world. And when all of the events that are being discussed in 2 Peter chapter 3, in verse 9 and following, the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the elements will melt with intensive heat, and the earth and its works will be burned up. That particular day, God knows when that's going to be. He has not informed the angels on when that day is going to be. And while Jesus was in the flesh, he was not privy to that information. That was not information that was given to Jesus while he was on the earth. Only the Father knows. But what Jesus does instruct them in verse 37 is this. He says, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating, drinking, they were marrying and given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away." Now this is the first of several sections that are going to bring us all the way through chapter 25 that have to do with preparation. Now there was a way that they were supposed to prepare for the destruction of Jerusalem. Now Jesus is going to teach them how they can prepare for the judgment day, for the second coming of Christ. In chapter 24, verses 36 through 44, he's going to talk about the dangers of no preparation. Those people in Noah's day, they weren't ready. They were not prepared. And so that's going to be what he's going to discuss first, the danger of no preparation at all. And then he's going to follow that with the dangers of delayed preparation, chapter 24, verses 41 through 51, 45 through 51, and that's going to bring us through the conclusion of the remainder of chapter 24. Then he's going to follow that with the parable of the 10 virgins, chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, and that's going to talk about the dangers of partial preparation. And then he'll follow that with examples of proper and improper preparation. When we talk about the parable of the talents, will be those that properly prepared and those that improperly prepared. And then this entire section that has to do with preparation will end with the section in chapter 25, verses 31 through 34, which has to do with the result of one's preparation. All right? Now, let's go back then and look at this section beginning in verse 36, and we're talking about the dangers of no preparation. It's going to be like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and given in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. What were people doing? Were they preparing for the flood? No. They were going along their normal activities. Now, he is not condemning the practice of eating and drinking, of marrying and giving in marriage. There's nothing wrong with those things. The problem was that they were focused on those things and they were not focused upon spiritual things. And as a result of their focusing on physical things and not spiritual, they were not prepared. He says, and until the day that Noah entered the ark, right up until the day that the flood was about to come, still no preparation was going to be made. Now, he goes on to say, and they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. All right, so when the flood hit, then for that moment in time, they realized that they were unprepared, and he says that's the way the coming of the Son of Man is going to be. Now, all of this illustrates the point that Jesus was making in verse 36, and that is, but of that day and hour no man knows. We have had people from the time of Christ until our present day that continue to try to predict when the second coming is going to be. We've had individuals that have given us days and said on this particular day Jesus is going to come. We've had individuals that have predicted months, and some have said it's going to be a particular year. And you can go back and you can isolate different years. 1914 was predicted. 1944 was predicted. 1975 was predicted. 1996 was predicted. All of these various years were predicted to be times that Jesus was going to come again. But he said in verse 36 that no one knows when that's going to happen. God's not going to give us signs. You see, we had the signs for the destruction of Jerusalem. We're not going to have signs for the second coming. Therefore, we need to not be like these that had no preparation, like those during the days of Noah. That's the point that he's making. It is not a part of God's plan for us to know when he's going to come, probably because he knows that we'd wait until the last minute to get prepared. He wants us to live in a state of preparation. Now keep that in mind as we go on through and look at verse 40. There will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. There is nothing wrong with what these men and these women are doing. The illustration that Jesus is making is one was prepared and one was not prepared. Now, this is not teaching what some have labeled the doctrine of the rapture, where one is raptured up to heaven and the other one is left here on the earth. He's talking about one was prepared, and so he was taken to be with his Lord, and the other was not prepared. Therefore, he is going to be judged and sent to eternal condemnation. It wasn't that the occupation was wrong. It wasn't that what they were doing. So people can work side by side, and one's saved and one's lost. What's the difference between the 2 men? What is the difference between the 2 women? There were no differences. They were both doing the same job. There were no differences except one was prepared and one was not. That's what this whole section is all about. He says, therefore, now this shows us even more clearly that that is what Jesus means. Be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. You've got to watch. You've got to be prepared, because you are not going to know the day that Jesus is going to come. You're just not going to know. Therefore, you've got to be on the alert. He says, but be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed his house to be broken into. All of us know this as a fact of life. We prepare for bedtime by going around, checking the windows and checking the latches on the door to make sure everything is locked and secured, because it's not that we are expecting the house to be broken into or a thief to come and try to steal our possessions, but it's preparation. Now, if a man knew ahead of time that a thief was going to come, what do you suppose that he would have done? He would have gone through great lengths to make sure that his house was not going to be broken into. If you told me, Denny says, tonight we're going to come and we're going to rob your house, well, guess what I'm going to do that night? I'm going to have extra security. I'm going to make doubly sure that all the windows and all the doors are latched. I'm not going to allow you to break into my house. If you tell me that you're coming, I'm going to make extra preparation. Jesus says, for this reason, you be ready too, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not think that he will. We're not going to think that he's going to come now. And so we've got all of these people that are saying Jesus is going to come at this particular year, or Jesus is going to come at this month, or Jesus is going to come on this day. That can't be right, because Jesus says, I'm coming at a time you don't think I'm going to come. He's going to catch us by surprise. The key is preparation. We need to be prepared for when Jesus does come. We live in a state of preparation, just like the wise man continually has his house prepared just in case tonight is the night the thief decides to try to break in. All right, then beginning with verse 45, Jesus is going to start talking about the next section that we have here, and that's the dangers of delayed preparation. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, who is his master put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave who his master finds so doing when he comes. He didn't delay, even though the master was gone. He was busy doing the work that needed to be done. He wasn't doing the work because he expected the master to come. He was just ready. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But of that evil slave who says in his heart, my master is not coming for a long time. Now this is a word that in the Greek is going to be repeated several times. It's literally the word lingers. It has to do with time. He thinks he's got lots of time. And so shall begin to beat his fellow slaves, and eat and drink with drunkards. And the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour which he does not know, and shall cut him in pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Weeping shall be there, and the gnashing of teeth. This is always Jesus' terminology to talk about the state of condemnation that a person finds themselves in when in fact they are disobedient. Okay, so when we look at this second section of Jesus' teaching, we have one slave who doesn't put off what needs to be done. We have another slave who is thinking that his master is not going to come for a long time, and so he puts off the duties that he's been assigned. The application for this, I hope, is clear. But we need to make sure that we're not thinking that Jesus is going to come 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and I've got plenty of time. This is one of the tools of Satan. He wants us to think that we have plenty of time and we can repent and we can get our lives right sometime down the road. If today, as you're listening to this tape, you see that you need to make some changes in your life, don't delay. Jesus' teaching here in Matthew 24 is telling us we need to get our lives right now and not delay, not be like the wicked slave. If we end up being caught unprepared like the wicked slave, we will find weeping and the gnashing of teeth to be indicative of our lives as we spend eternity in hell. Where it is our hope and our prayer that that will not describe anyone who is watching these tapes. All right, we'll stop there. In our next class, we'll begin with chapter 25.